Welcome to another quiet journey into the forgotten corridors of ancient myth, or gently watching the flicker of a low light. Allow yourself to drift into a different time, a time when gods were believed to walk among men, when the wind carried stories rather than noise, and the world was filled with signs, omens, and rituals older than memory, and the slow-turning wheels of human history. As you settle in, perhaps lying beneath a soft blanket, know this is the Greece hidden in shadows, in caves, in ruins, in old scrolls and whispered warnings. A Greece filled with powerful gods, but also with punishments. A Greece where beauty could be dangerous, and where curses could change the course of a life, or echo through eternity. Tonight, we enter the myth-soaked world of ancient Greece, but not the heroic, shining Greece of golden temples and triumphant battles. A world where temples were cold and echoing, where the sea god Poseidon ruled with unchecked power, where the goddess Athena protected purity at a cost, and where Medusa, once mortal, became something far more eternal. Tonight's story belongs to one of the most haunting figures in all mythology. Her name ... is Medusa, a name that still carries a chill even now, a name wrapped in fear, mystery, and misunderstanding. You might already picture her in your mind, her eyes glowing, her hair writhing with living snakes, or for being caught between two rival gods in a temple that should have been sacred. And why, even now, her eyes still hold a question that has never fully been answered. A creature to be feared, a monster, a villain. That is how she is often shown. Not the cartoonish image, but the long, winding history beneath the surface. We will uncover not just what happened, but why and how, and what it tells us about gods ... and men, and the quiet cruelties that live behind legend. Was not born a monster, but made into one, sculpted into stone shields, painted in Renaissance canvases, or lurking at the edges of children's storybooks. But what if she was none of those things? What if Medusa? What if her so-called curse was not divine punishment for evil, but something far more tragic? A punishment for loyalty or beauty? Tonight, we will take our time to explore her full story. Not the rushed myth, we will explore the world she knew, not just as a myth, but as a woman of flesh and thought, of fear and silence. Let yourself imagine it now. The marble floor of the temple, still cool from the fading night. The smell of oil lamps, long extinguished. The distant sound of waves crashing on rocks far below. A woman kneels, her hair braided neatly, her thoughts focused on prayer. But far above, the gods are already watching, and fate begins to turn its wheel. This is the story of why Medusa was cursed by the gods. So now, settle in. Let the past speak slowly. Let history and myth lull you toward rest. And let us begin. A day in the life before the curse, the calm before the gods stirred. Imagine the slow warmth of dawn spreading across the gentle coastline of ancient Greece. The sunlight, still drowsy itself, spills over olive trees and stone paths. There is no rush here, no clamor of traffic, no sharp voices. But not the Medusa you think you know. Not yet. This Medusa does not yet have serpents for hair. Her eyes do not turn men to stone. There is no aura of monstrosity about her. She is simply a woman young, quiet, devout. Her robe is linen, pale and simple. Cold water from a clay jug, poured over her hands, her brow, her feet. Medusa walks past these images every day, never imagining her own face would one day be added to myth. Farmers herd goats up rocky hillsides. Fishermen mend their nets on the shore, their fingers calloused, their backs curved from years bent to labor. Children chase each other between fig trees, laughing and breathless. The village is small, familiar. Everyone knows one another. They know Medusa too, not personally, but by sight. They bow their heads slightly when she passes. Sometimes they sang. Sometimes they recited verses from memory praises to Athena, stories of heroes shaped by wisdom instead of strength. And sometimes they simply sat, listening to the far-off hush of the sea. His moods shifted like storms. He was vast, powerful, unpredictable, and his attention was dangerous. Medusa's voice, when she spoke, was low. Her eyes were thoughtful. Some said she was beautiful, but hers was not a beauty meant for admiration. It was veiled, protected, reserved. They speak in whispers once she's gone. There is respect in their eyes, and perhaps something else distant. For she belongs to the goddess, not Poseidon, not the one with power, but Medusa. In the eyes of the gods, it mattered little how or why. What mattered was that the space had been violated, that something sacred had been undone. And in her rage, she transformed her. Her hair became a nest of serpents, writhing and hissing. The olive branches sway gently. The sea murmurs to itself in the distance. Medusa walks slowly through the garden courtyard, a basket in one hand, filled with fresh-cut herbs. Her face is serene. Her eyes are clear. She does not yet know what the gods have planned. Her gaze became fatal. No longer could she look upon the world without destroying it. She was cast out, banished from the temple, from society, from everything she had known, from the quiet, rhythmic life she had once lived. And to belong to a god is to be apart from ordinary life, never imagining that her name would echo not in prayer, but in fear, not as a priestess, not as a servant of Athena, but as a woman. Others leave it deliberately vague, as though the truth was too complicated or shameful to explain. But one detail remains consistent. It happened within the temple, within the sacred walls dedicated to Athena, the space where no man was meant to cross. She remains only a woman, a priestess, a servant of Athena, walking between the columns of an old stone temple, still human, still whole, still unbroken. The space where purity was to be preserved above all else. For now, she is simply a servant of the goddess, a priestess, trusted, chosen, set apart. Purity was not only symbolic, it was law. And though such laws may seem harsh now, in her world, they were absolute. The body was not wholly hers. It was the goddess's vessel. To break that purity, even unwillingly, was to break faith itself. And the punishment for such desecration was severe. But Medusa did not think of this. She did not need to. Her life was narrow, peaceful, predictable. Or so it seemed. A silent prayer to Athena, offered not for requests, but for presence. Then she steps into the courtyard where the olive trees grow. Her pace is slow, her gaze modest. She does not linger. She does not speak unless necessary. She returns to the temple before the sun has begun its descent, always before the evening shadows reach the marble steps. For inside the temple, rules are sacred, and the most sacred of all is purity. She gathers herbs for offerings, bay leaves, thyme, a twist of laurel. She prepares the altar, lays the offerings out, sprinkles barley over the flames. The smoke rises in thin lines, twisting lazily upward, disappearing into the morning light. Her dark hair is tightly braided, each strand coiled with care. Her hands are steady as she lights the morning lamps, one by one, each flame flickering into gentle life. Only the soft sound of birds beginning to stir, the hush of waves brushing quietly against the distant shore, and the rustle of morning wind weaving through tall cypress trees. In this quiet hour, life begins in silence. Far from the clamoring cities of Athens or Corinth, there stands a humble temple, its stones pale with age, its columns laced with creeping vines, its marble altar worn smooth from years of careful tending. It is not a grand temple, not one of those celebrated in stories and songs, but it is sacred all the same. This place, nestled against the slow curve of the sea, is dedicated to the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom, of war. Its routines, its rituals, its sacred spaces, all as familiar to her as breath. She knows which stones creak in the floor. She knows how the sea breeze bends the incense smoke just before rain. She knows the prayers spoken under one's breath, the way olive oil must be poured slowly onto the altar so as not to startle the flame. The rhythm of her days is slow, deliberate, peaceful. There is little conversation, little noise, only the quiet devotion of sacred life, of purity and quiet fury. Here, in the still hush of early morning, her priestesses begin their day. One of them moves through the cool stone halls with practiced calm. Her name is Medusa. She has done this for years. Perhaps since girlhood, the temple is her world. Each day begins with purification. The temple walls are carved with stories, Athena's triumphs, her wisdom, her still gaze turned toward justice. Outside the temple, life continues in soft cycles. Sometimes she walks to the edge of the village, perhaps to collect oil or wine or grain for the temple's stores. To be a priestess of Athena was to be untouched. No man's hand, no lover's kiss, no whispered desire could stain the body or soul. In the quiet hours after sunset, the temple took on a different stillness. Shadows deepened. Lamps cast long orange light across the stone. The priestesses would gather in silence. But the gods, as the stories often remind us, do not always respect boundaries, especially gods of the sea. Poseidon, brother of Zeus, ruler of the oceans, lord of waves and earthquakes, he was not a gentle deity. At some point, how long before, we do not know, Poseidon noticed Medusa. The myths do not agree on how their encounter unfolded. Some say he wooed her. Some say he forced himself upon her. The temple was profaned, and Medusa, whether by choice or against her will, was marked. Medusa, who had served faithfully, who had lit every lamp, whispered every prayer, walked with reverence every day of her life, found herself condemned. The myths say Athena was enraged, not at Poseidon, but at Medusa. But that is the story as it comes later. For now, we linger still in the moments before, in the silence before the fall. The temple still stands in the golden light of late afternoon. There is peace in this moment. There is calm. And like all calm before a storm, it feels almost eternal. If we could stay here, in this moment, forever, perhaps we would. But history, like the sea, is always moving. And somewhere in the distance, the tide is beginning to turn. Medusa's story will soon change. But for now, and in that stillness, we begin to understand that even monsters were once innocent. The moment that changed everything, the air was heavy with silence. Not the comforting quiet of prayer or routine, but a stillness that pressed down like a stone. A kind of silence that seems to watch, to wait. A kind that settles in just before something changes forever. Medusa walked the marble halls of the temple with the same careful reverence she always had. Her bare feet moved across the stone with familiar ease. She knew every step, every crack, every place where the wind slipped in through the old columns. It was late afternoon. The sunlight slanted low through the doorway, spilling gold across the floor like paint. A flicker of unease in the flame of the lamps. Not within the temple of his niece, Athena. Their rivalry was well known, their histories tangled with old resentments. The temple was hers, and yet he entered. But in either telling, the truth remains. She was no longer untouched. They moved through mortal lives like storms, leaving ruin behind them without a glance. Perhaps still kneeling, her face turned toward the statue that no longer felt safe. The air was different. The stones, once warm with reverence, now felt cold. The lamp oil burned low, and from the shadows came silence. The sea, distant as it was, seemed to echo with a cruel laugh. And worse still, it happened in the holiest place, Athena's temple. The sacred space was defiled. She was a goddess, born from the head of Zeus, clothed in armor and intellect, blazing with divine clarity. That the purity she demanded from her priestesses was shattered, and Medusa, the mortal, was blamed, as if she had chosen it, as if it were her fault that a god had looked upon her with desire. Her arrival was like a crack of thunder behind the eyes, a weight that dropped into the space, a divine presence that demanded stillness, flesh to rock, breath to silence. The air, once still with peace, now thickened with desecration. The way the birds outside had gone quiet for just a moment too long. The world itself, perhaps, knew what was drawing near, not with wind, but with life. Snakes, dozens, then hundreds, coiled where strands had once been. They twisted and hissed, alive with rage and warning. Whether from fear, disgust, or divine command, they left her, alone, transformed, condemned. Her limbs trembled, her eyes burned. Her skin prickled and pulled, no longer soft, no longer warm. The temple light reflected off her skin like polished stone. Somewhere deep where no light reached, somewhere where no eyes could meet hers, where silence wrapped around her like a second skin, where the snakes hissed softly, endlessly, reminding her of what she had become. Outside, the cicadas were beginning their endless chant. Inside, the air was cool and dim. Shadows lengthened along the walls. The scent of burning olive oil drifted through the corridors. She had spent the morning in ritual, preparing offerings, sweeping the sacred courtyard, lighting incense beneath Athena's statue. She had sung softly with the other priestesses at dawn, their voices blending into a low, humming devotion. There was nothing unusual in the day, no sign of what was coming. And yet, if one listened closely, there was a subtle shift. They were judgment, a command carried by divine breath, a decree etched not in ink, but in transformation, a strange hush in the sea breeze. Medusa was alone when he came. Poseidon, earth-shaker, sea-bringer, god of waves and horses in storm. But myths do not speak of whether she wanted it, of whether her gaze lifted in fear or defiance. They do not say whether her voice cried out in protest, or if it was swallowed by the stone walls. The myths do not ask what she felt. They only record what happened next. She did not ask for divine attention. She did not seek transformation. She was a priestess, a woman, a servant of the gods. He did not belong there, not in that place. She was punished. The myths say he saw Medusa and desired her, that her beauty stirred something wild in him. Poseidon took her. Some say he seduced her. Others say he forced himself upon her. When it was done, Poseidon left. Gods are like that in the old stories. Medusa, alone now, sat in the dim light, perhaps collapsed near the altar. And then came Athena. She did not enter in the way humans do. She did not need to. She saw the temple. She saw what had been done. And she saw Medusa. But where mortals might have shown pity, Athena showed fury. The myths tell us that she was angry not at Poseidon, but at Medusa, that the sacred space had been broken. Athena did not speak. Or perhaps she did, but her words were not human. Medusa's body began to change. Her hair, once tightly braided, unspooled and writhed. And worst of all, her gaze became fatal. No longer could she look upon others without consequence. Her eyes, once clear and devout, became weapons. Anyone who met them directly would turn to stone. It was not a blessing. It was exile. It was isolation. It was a punishment dressed as power. The temple doors, once open to her, closed. The other priestesses did not speak. They did not approach. She fled. Some say she ran into the wilds. Others say she found shelter in a forgotten cave far from the sea. But even there, she was not safe. Not from memory. not from dreams, not from the echo of Poseidon's touch or Athena's judgment. Her body had changed, but her heart still remembered. The cool stone of the temple floor, the warmth of morning light on the courtyard herbs, the sound of the sea when it was still gentle, the way her name once meant devotion, the way her life once belonged to something sacred. Now it belonged to myth, to stories whispered in fear, to images carved on shields and scrawled on amphorae. Medusa, the monster. Medusa, the cursed. But we must remember, as we move slowly through this part of her story, that she was not born that way. And for that, so she lived far away, hidden from the world, alone, her only company, the sound of hissing, the cold of stone, and the memory of a life she once lived. But even monsters do not remain forgotten forever. The cave was silent, not the silence of peace, but of absence. The kind of silence that grows so large becomes a sound of its own, a slow echo, a breath that never ends. Deep within the forgotten cliffs, away from villages, temples, and even prayers, Medusa found her refuge or her prison, or both. There were no windows, no torches, only the cold light that filtered in from cracks in the rock, thin as threads, pale as bone. She knew what her eyes could do. She had learned the weight of them. She had seen a curious bird turn to stone before it could land. She had once stepped toward a deer, only for it to freeze mid-step, locked forever in terror. The air was damp, the stone walls slick with moss and condensation. Somewhere far off, the sea crashed and called, but here, her body had changed. Her breath came slower. Her heart, if it beat, did so with the rhythm of something older, more distant. The snakes in her hair coiled and rested, then stirred, then coiled again, her steps slow. Even alone, she feared the reach of her power. What was once a gift, the ability to see, to connect, to witness, had become a curse. She saw nothing now, only the inside of her mind. The world no longer gave her new moments, only echoes of the old. They were no longer foreign. They were companions, extensions of her will. They reacted to her mood. When she was calm, they rested. When sorrow stirred, they writhed gently. When anger came, rarely and briefly, they rose like a crown. They whispered to her, perhaps, not in words, but in memory, in presence, in warning. It did not reach. Time passed differently in this place. It did not tick or march. It drifted, soft and shapeless. And within it, Medusa lived. She did not sleep as mortals sleep. Not anymore. The sound of her own voice caught in her throat. She rarely saw her reflection. There were no mirrors here, no pools of still water, nothing that could capture her gaze. She avoided it instinctively. The laughter of the other priestesses in moments of rest, the smooth feel of clay, jugs in her hand, the warmth of the marble after the sun had struck it for hours. She began to walk with her head bowed, her eyes closed, and in that mind, memories swirled. The temple, the olive trees, the prayers, and then the moment, Poseidon's presence, the shift in the air, the fear she could not name, and finally, Athena, her judgment, her transformation, her silence. She replayed it over and over, not because she wanted to, but because it was all she had. The snakes, over time, became a part of her, not just physically, but spiritually. A foe. In time, her name left human lips, not as a memory, but as a warning. Children were told not to wander too far, lest they meet the eyes of Medusa. Travelers spoke of statues in strange places, figures mid-movement, arms raised, mouths open, frozen not by artistry, but by something more final. Heroes whispered of her as a challenge, a trophy to be claimed, a monster to be slain. And still, she waited, not for rescue. She knew none would come, not for redemption. The gods did not forgive what they had declared unholy. She simply existed. And as she did, the world changed. Temples fell into ruin. Cities rose and crumbled. New gods came. New prayers were spoken. But her cave remained. Her silence remained. And so did the question. Was she cursed for what happened? Or for who she was? Was it her beauty? Was it her devotion? Was it her proximity to power? The myths, written mostly by men, do not ask. They record her as a threat, a beast, but there is another way to see her. Not as a villain, but as a symbol of innocence punished, of power twisted, of the way women were blamed for the desires of gods. Her eyes turned men to stone, yes, but long before that, their eyes turned her into prey. And when she gained power, she was cast out for it. Even in her cave, she remained watched. By gods, by stories, by memory. And somewhere in that distant world, Athena watched too. Did she feel guilt? Did she regret her judgment? Or was she too a victim of a divine system that demanded purity above justice? We do not know. The gods, even now, remain silent. But Medusa's story endures, in carvings, in paintings, in whispers. Not because she was a monster, but because she became something the world could not ignore. A woman who bore the weight of the gods. A victim turned legend. A priestess turned symbol. A name turned into warning. And eventually into question. And still, the cave is there, quiet, untouched, waiting, just beyond the edge of memory. The origins beneath the stone, tracing the ancient Medusa, long before the name Medusa became feared, before it turned cold in the mouths of poets and warriors, before it echoed through marble halls and ink scrolls as a word of danger and dread. There was simply an image, a face, a shape, etched in the corners of temples, carved into stone, painted in fading ochre, and black on clay vessels half buried in soil. The word itself means to ward off, to turn away harm. And so, the image of the Gorgon, this early, unnamed Medusa, was not a curse. It was a shield, a guardian placed at the thresholds of homes and temples, on armor and weaponry, over the entrances of tombs and shrines. Always watching, always protecting, the face with wide eyes, hair that seemed to writhe, mouth open, sometimes in a grin, sometimes a grimace, and always watching. This was not yet Medusa, not the Gorgon of storybooks, not the cursed woman banished by gods. All three were daughters of ancient sea deities, Phorcys and Ceto, but only Medusa was mortal. Only Medusa could be killed, and only Medusa was remembered. Some scholars believe the number 3 has symbolic power birth, life, and death, past, present, and future, body, mind, and spirit. The Gorgons, with their combined traits, may have once represented a cycle of transformation powerful but misunderstood. But she was beginning to form, slowly, quietly, like a figure emerging from mist. In the earliest days of Greek culture, long before the classical myths took their final form, artisans and worshippers depicted strange female figures, powerful and strange, watching from sacred places. But even here, the image is not always terrifying. It is stylized, symbolic, like a sigil, a boundary marker, something to be respected. This imagery connects her not only to death and danger, but to something older, the mistress of animals, a widespread archetype in early Mediterranean and Near Eastern religion. It reflects the fears and desires of its storytellers. And in a world where female power was increasingly viewed with suspicion, Medusa's role changed. A powerful woman who stood between humanity and the wild. One who could control nature, who held the line between chaos and order. Archaeologists, brushing away layers of dust and soil, began to uncover these forms in layers of potsherds and fragments. The face appeared again and again, across centuries and across regions. Bulging eyes, a wide mouth, a head wreathed in serpentine lines or twisted coils of hair. The purpose of these faces was not to frighten, but to protect. In temples, Medusa's face was still placed on shields and armor, her power co-opted by male heroes like Perseus. Her image used to frighten enemies on the battlefield. She remained useful, even in death. In Mesopotamia, protective spirits were carved into gateways. In Egypt, fierce deities stood guard at the entrances to the afterlife. The goddess who cursed Medusa now wore her image. The story, if read closely, reveals a strange irony. Medusa's power is taken from her and then wielded by those who condemned her. The gods, newly elevated and more refined, no longer had room for the chaotic, untamed symbols of earlier belief. Slowly, what was once protective became dangerous. What was once sacred became monstrous. And in pre-Hellenic Greece, these female faces, wild-haired, unmoving, stern kept watch against whatever might try to enter uninvited. These early forms are known today by scholars as apotropaic. This kind of protective image was common across ancient cultures, but something happened over time. The snakes in her hair still writhe, but now they frame a woman, not a monster. She becomes beautiful again. Or perhaps the artist could no longer see her as entirely monstrous. As the myths of Olympus solidified, as Zeus and Athena and Poseidon rose in their grandeur, these older, wilder figures began to change. And Medusa, who may have once been a goddess in her own right, was reimagined. Her blood, spilled upon the earth, gives birth to Pegasus the winged horse, a creature of purity and flight, something light born from something dark, something free born from something cursed. By the time the poet Hesiod wrote Theogony, sometime around the 7th century BCE, Medusa had become one of the three Gorgon sisters Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa. Even this trio of Gorgons has its mysteries. Why three? Why sisters? Why is Medusa the only mortal among them? And Medusa, the mortal one, the one who could fall, perhaps symbolized the cost of transformation itself. The oldest visual depictions of Medusa, those found on Greek pottery and temple pediments, often show her as grotesque, her tongue lolling out, her face wide and inhuman. In many of these depictions, Medusa is shown in a symmetrical pose, arms raised, wings outstretched, flanked by animals. Perhaps Medusa was once a figure like this, a deity of wilderness, a guardian of thresholds, a protector of sacred space, and never allowed to return. And perhaps it was only with the arrival of patriarchal myth, where gods ruled with thunder and spear, where women's power was either harnessed or punished, that Medusa became something else. We must remember that mythology is not fixed. It shifts, it grows, no longer a guardian. But as they flow through generations, they widen, deepen, collect sediment. They carry the voices of many, and sometimes they change direction entirely. Now, a threat. A woman cursed for transgression cast out, and then slain by a noble hero. That was the shape of the tale passed through centuries. No longer a protector, now a monster. As scholars re-examined the stories told by ancient voices, they began to ask why certain figures were depicted as they were. Why were some cast as villains? Why were women, in particular, so often blamed, punished, transformed, of empathy, of memory? But the transition was not sudden. Even as her myth developed into the one we now recognize, traces of her older self remained. Perhaps the most famous example of this is the aegis, the shield or breastplate carried by Athena, said to bear the head of Medusa at its center. Was it conquest? Or was it memory? Was Athena claiming the power she had once destroyed? Was she honoring Medusa's strength? Or displaying her defeat? The myths do not say, but the art does. In Roman mosaics, Medusa appears with a more human face. Her features soften. The grotesque grin becomes a sorrowful stare. Writers like Helene Sixus and Sylvia Federici re-examined her tale, not as a warning against dangerous women, but as a reflection of how patriarchal societies turned powerful women into threats. Her image, once painted with horror, was now redrawn in empathy. In later depictions, Medusa becomes tragic. She is not merely slain, she is pitied, not as a call for vengeance, but as a declaration that the story belongs to her now. Even as Perseus decapitates her, the moment is not always one of triumph. It becomes reflective, a sorrowful act, a necessary evil. In these stories, her death is not the end. Pegasus becomes a symbol of poetry, of inspiration, of transcendence. And Medusa, in this way, gives birth to something the world treasures. Even in death, she creates beauty. Even in silence, she speaks. This paradox of monster and mother, of victim and power sits at the heart of her myth. And it is why, even now, Medusa lingers. In stone, in stories, there is resilience. In symbols, she is the face that never looks away. The guardian who became the accused, the woman who was cursed, reclaimed and remembered. Medusa in modernized stories, like rivers, shift course over time. They begin somewhere narrow, a spring of simple origin, cool and clear. Medusa's story, for much of recorded history, was one of warning, a monster to be feared. But in more recent years, the river has shifted. Slowly, gently, the myth has bent back toward Medusa herself, not as an object of fear, but as a subject of reflection. It began, perhaps, not with a scream, but with a question. What if Medusa was never a monster? This question began echoing more and more in the last 100 years. And when those questions were asked of Medusa's myth, the answers were quiet, but profound. They began to reveal something different. A priestess, a victim, a woman caught in the gaze of gods. He told the story with a kind of tragic distance, inviting readers to see more than just a creature to be slain. A figure punished not for wrongdoing, but for being seen, for being there, for being desired. In feminist theory, Medusa became a potent symbol. The gaze that once petrified others was reinterpreted. Medusa, they argued, did not turn men to stone because she was evil. She turned them to stone because they feared her gaze, because she saw them, because she existed outside their control. In this way, her power became metaphoric. The petrifying gaze was no longer an act of violence, but a mirror reflecting back the fear and guilt of those who wronged her. Modern artists, too, began to explore these ideas. In sculpture, Medusa stands tall, no longer cowering in darkness, but facing the world. Some statues even place her with Perseus's head in her hand, inverting the old myth entirely. Poets gave her back her voice. Painters gave her back her humanity. Filmmakers, playwrights, scholars, all began to peel back the layers of her myth, uncovering not a monster, but a woman silenced. And as these reinterpretations gathered strength, they began to influence how we teach and tell the story. In classrooms and books, Medusa is no longer introduced solely as a villain. She is now a subject of analysis, a lens through which we can examine power, shame, gender, and transformation. Her myth becomes a map of trauma, of the way society often punishes those it harms, of the way victims are blamed for their own violation. And yet, beneath all this sorrow, Medusa survived, even when she was driven into exile, even when her story was twisted, even when she was killed. Her image persisted. Her name endured. She became more than her suffering. She became a figure of reflection. And this endurance, this lingering presence, is part of what makes her so powerful in cultural memory. Because Medusa's myth is not just about what happened. It's about what was remembered, and how it was remembered, and who was allowed to remember it. Even in ancient Rome, long before modern reinterpretations, there were hints that her story held more complexity than it seemed. Writers like Lucan and Ovid portrayed her death with a tone of sorrow, even pity. Ovid, in particular, offered a version of the tale where Medusa had once been beautiful, and her transformation was a punishment, not an act of evil, but of vengeance. And that crack, small as it was in the traditional framing, allowed later thinkers to look deeper. Today, Medusa appears everywhere, in novels and essays, in murals and museums, on protest signs and jewelry. She is tattooed on arms and carved into rings. She is invoked by activists, by survivors, by artists seeking to reclaim power that was taken or silenced. Not all interpretations agree. Some still see her as a dangerous force. Some embrace her monstrosity, not as shame, but as defiance. But all of them, each in their own way, bring Medusa back into view. They allow her to be seen. And in doing so, they return to her what was taken. Her story, her name, her gaze, and perhaps, in some way, her peace. Because to be seen, truly seen, is no small thing, especially for those who have been told to hide. Medusa's myth, like all myths, carries many layers. There is horror, yes. There is injustice. But there is also transformation. And not only the transformation of her body, but of her meaning. From guardian to monster, from exile to memory, from feared to revered, and now to something else entirely. A symbol not just of suffering, but of survival. A reminder that even those condemned by gods and kings may endure. That even silence does not erase truth. That even a stone face can speak, if only we are quiet enough to listen. So the next time you see her image, etched on a museum wall, hanging from a pendant, or glowing from a page, you may think differently. You may see not a monster, but a mirror, a face that holds many truths, a myth that speaks softly from the edges of time, and within it, a voice that says, I am still here. The gods, the power, and the price of being seen, the gods of Olympus were not distant. They did not dwell in the unreachable heavens, silent and serene, beyond the grasp of mortal understanding. No, the Olympians were near, ever present, ever watching, not above the world, but inside it, woven into its fabric, intervening, judging, favoring, punishing, but they could also be cruel. And most often, they were indifferent, concerned less with mortal fairness, and more with divine pride, favor, and power. They ruled with thrones and thunderbolts, waves and shadows, and around them spun a constellation of lesser, but no less important deities: Athena, Hera, Demeter, Apollo, Artemis, Ares. To live in ancient Greece was to live within their gaze. They were the sky and the sea, the harvest and the storm, the anger of war and the hush of twilight. They could be kind, yes. Among these gods, three held the greatest sway: Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades' brothers, who divided the world into sky, sea, and underworld. Their stories were not only myths, but mirrors, showing us how power moves, how justice bends, how decisions are made when the divine holds the scales. They were sanctuaries, and the priestesses who served her were bound by vows, not only of devotion, but of chastity. Their lives were set apart, elevated, shielded from the chaos of desire and the uncertainty of affection. Beautiful not just in body, but in devotion. Pure, faithful, gentle, each with domains, each with stories, each with egos. But the gods were not just characters. They were concepts, reflections of human qualities made large and luminous. She was born not in the way mortals are born, but from her father's head emerging fully formed, armored, and radiant. She was intelligent, yes, but also proud. Just, but strict. She valued order, discipline, purity. He commanded storms, shaped coastlines, caused earthquakes. And he was known for his pursuits of nymphs, of mortals, of even goddesses. His wants were rarely denied. She was a virgin goddess, untouched by passion, and she demanded the same of her sacred spaces, that he came upon her in the temple of Athena, and that there, within that sacred space, he forced himself upon her. To understand Medusa's fate, we must first understand the world of the gods. It begins with Athena. Still others avoid the question altogether, speaking only of the aftermath. Daughter of Zeus, goddess of wisdom, of war, of strategy and learning. Her temples were not merely buildings. Medusa was one of these priestesses. She was beautiful. That much all versions of the myth agree on. But beauty in the world of gods was a dangerous thing. It attracted not only praise, but attention. And among the gods, none was more driven by desire than Poseidon, brother of Zeus, ruler of the seas. His temper was vast, like the ocean. His strength unmatched. The myth, as we know it, tells us that Poseidon desired Medusa. The stories differ in their detail. Some say she was seduced. Others say she was unwilling. But what remains clear is this: the temple was defiled, and Athena was furious. She did not punish Poseidon. She did not strike him down, or even speak his name. Instead, she turned to Medusa and transformed her. Her hair, once long and lustrous, became a nest of serpents. Her gaze, once soft and kind, became a weapon turning any who met her eyes to stone. Her body was changed, twisted, made monstrous. And for this pride, her children are slain. She is turned to stone, her grief eternal, not by design, but by accident. And for this, he is transformed into a stag and torn apart by his own hounds. She was no longer a priestess, no longer a woman. She became a Gorgon, and she fled. Continue on, banished to the edges of the world. This moment, so quiet in the myths, so briefly described, holds an enormous weight. Why was Medusa punished? Was it truly for desecrating the temple? Was it because Athena, bound by divine law, could not let the violation of her space go unpunished? Or was it because in the realm of gods, justice does not look like ours? In this divine order, power is its own law. Poseidon, as a god, could not be touched. He acted without consequence. Athena, protective of her domain, made a decision not to seek fairness, but to restore order. Medusa, the mortal, became the scapegoat, the symbol, the correction. And this is the pattern that appears again and again in Greek myth. The powerless bearing the cost of divine quarrels. In the story of Niobe, a queen boasts of her many children more than Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis. In the story of Actaeon, a hunter stumbles upon Artemis bathing. In the story of Semele, a mortal woman dares to ask Zeus to reveal his true form. He does, and she burns to ash. In all these tales, the pattern is the same. Mortals pay the price. And the gods? This is not to say that the gods were evil, but they were not kind. They were not human. Their sense of justice was different, less about right and wrong, more about balance, about maintaining their image, their domain, their control. And Medusa's transformation reflects this. Athena may have been preserving the sanctity of her temple. She may have been trying to protect Medusa, in a way making her untouchable, giving her power. But the result was exile, loneliness, and a legacy of fear. The Olympians were often caught in paradox. Athena, a goddess of wisdom, chooses punishment over compassion. Poseidon, a god of the sea's vastness, chooses conquest over respect. Zeus, the king of gods, is known more for his affairs than for his rule. And yet, they were revered, because the people of ancient Greece did not expect perfection from their gods. They expected power, intervention. For when a mortal drew the gaze of Olympus when their name, their form, their presence reached divine ears, it often brought not favor, but the kind that rewrites them completely, into something unrecognizable, into something legendary, or monstrous, or tragic, but transformation, awe. The temples were built not as places of comfort, but of reverence. The sacrifices were not only gifts, but obligations, turned from a person with a name, a life, a purpose, into a symbol. And he answers by turning her into a laurel tree. Her voice disappears. Her skin becomes bark. Her limbs branch skyward. She escapes, but at the cost of herself. Into an object, into a myth. Her identity was swallowed by the tale that replaced it. Her name no longer called out as a woman, but as a warning to keep favor, to avoid wrath. When she dares to challenge Athena in a contest of art, her tapestry wins, too honest, too sharp. Athena, enraged, transforms her into a spider. Her talent remains, but she is cursed to spin in silence, feared and fragile, hanging in corners, to be seen but not punished. And so the people lived within this divine web, accepting that sometimes misfortune came not from sin, but from the attention of the divine, a sequence that Medusa could not stop. She was not asked. She was not granted choice. Medusa, then, becomes a lesson. To hide her from Hera's wrath, he transforms her into a cow. She wanders the earth, voiceless, hunted, marked. Not just in beauty. When her pregnancy is discovered, she is cast out and changed into a bear. Later, she is nearly killed by her own son. Her story ends among the stars, not as herself, but as a constellation. Not just in blame, but in proximity. She stood too close to gods, too close to Poseidon's desire, too close to Athena's pride, too close to divine order, and the cost was everything. Divine echoes, the cost of being seen by the gods. In the ancient world, to be seen by the gods was not always a blessing. It could be a fate far worse, and not the kind of transformation that lifts a person higher. Medusa's story sits within this quiet and perilous truth. Would be forgotten, because what happened to her was not just punishment. It was conversion. She was changed, and that warning has echoed through centuries. But what does it mean to be transformed by a god? In many Greek myths, this moment of divine gaze brings with it not clarity, but obliteration, a reshaping, a breaking of one's story. Take Daphne, the nymph pursued by Apollo. To escape his desire, she prays to her father, a river god. Or Arachne, a mortal woman skilled in weaving. Or Io, a priestess loved by Zeus. Or Callisto, another of Artemis's companions, who was tricked and violated by Zeus. In all these tales, the pattern holds. A mortal encounters the divine, not through choice, but through collision. And the result is transformation, sometimes framed as mercy, sometimes as punishment, always as erasure. Her temple, her home, her name. This divine gaze does not grant understanding. It strips it away, and Medusa's fate is the clearest example. When Poseidon saw her not just with interest, but with intent, it set in motion a chain of divine actions. She was simply seen, and then she was changed. Her punishment was not death. It was living, in a form that others could not look upon without turning to stone. It is a cruel irony that her gaze, once soft and sacred, became fatal, that her beauty, once a source of devotion, became a weapon, that her body, once belonging to her, was no longer hers to define. And it is here, in this uncomfortable silence, that we begin to see the deeper shape of her story. Medusa is not just a myth about monsters. It is a myth about power, about who holds it, about who suffers beneath it, about how memory works, when the gods are the ones telling the story. Because in ancient Greece, to be remembered often meant being transformed. The line between history and myth was always thin. A real woman could become a legend could become a warning, and a warning could live forever. But the woman, her voice would be silenced, and her truth would turn to stone. This pattern did not end in ancient times. Even today, we see echoes. People whose stories are told by others, whose pain is shaped by the hands of those more powerful, whose names are spoken more as symbols and as individuals. In this way, Medusa's story is timeless, because it asks something that still matters. What does it mean to be seen? Not just looked at, but truly seen. And what does it cost? For Medusa, the cost was everything. Her body. And even after death, she was not returned to herself. Her head, severed by Perseus, became a trophy, a tool. He carried it not as a memorial, but as a weapon. Used it to turn enemies to stone. Placed it on Athena's shield. Displayed it for glory. Even in death, she was still used. Still powerful, but not free. And yet, even in this, Medusa's legacy endured. Because power leaves marks. It leaves trails in stories, in symbols, in art. And Medusa, despite everything, left her mark. She was carved into shields to protect warriors, etched into temples to ward off evil, painted on urns and coins and frescoes. She refused to disappear, and slowly her story changed. Not all at once, but over centuries. People began to ask different questions, to look beyond the snakes, to wonder who she was before, who she might have been without the curse. And in that wondering, she was remembered, not just as a myth, but as a woman. This remembering is important, because myths are not only old stories, they are lenses, ways of seeing the world, and how we tell them shapes how we see ourselves. In Medusa's story, we see the danger of being visible, the pain of being blamed, the loneliness of being transformed. But we also see something else. We see resistance, endurance, the quiet defiance of a story that will not go away. And that is power too. Perhaps the gods never meant for us to remember her with pity. Perhaps Athena never thought her face would become a symbol of rage or sorrow or justice. Perhaps Poseidon never imagined that his actions would be questioned millennia later. But memory is strange. It wanders, it reshapes, and sometimes it returns. Now, when we look at Medusa's face on statues, in paintings, in books and dreams, we no longer see only fear. We see a story of being seen, of being silenced, of being powerful and punished, and yet of still being here, still watching, still remembered. Medusa through the eyes of power, from sacred to feared. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in the courtyard of an ancient Greek villa. It is late morning. The stones beneath your feet are warm from the sun, and there is the low sound of bees buzzing lazily among the lavender and thyme. The house belongs to a wealthy landowner, an aristocrat of influence and learning. Inside, the walls are covered with murals and mosaic scenes from the myths. The 12 labors of Heracles, the judgment of Paris. And there in a corner, a striking figure. A woman, her face frozen in anguish or fury, her hair alive with serpents. Medusa. She is a warning, a decoration, a talisman, a story etched into stone. To the man who owns this house, she is not a person. She is a symbol, a myth shaped by generations of male poets, philosophers, and priests, each adding their own layer of meaning, but as a reflection of fears and values, polished and reshaped to suit the needs of the powerful. Until the original woman, if there ever was one, is lost beneath them all. This was how Medusa was known in much of ancient Greek society, not as a living presence. Her transformation from temple servant to monstrous exile was not just a myth. It was a reflection of what the society feared and what it wished to control. In ancient Greece, the ideal woman was silent, obedient, unseen. She was kept indoors, managed by her father or husband, excluded from politics and philosophy. It explained, in poetic form, why power should remain with men, and why women who crossed those boundaries became monsters or victims or both. Even in literature, her presence was carefully framed, used to teach lessons, deliver moral consequences, or illustrate dangers to be avoided. Medusa, with her beauty, her independence, her divine appointment, and eventually her monstrous power, did not fit this ideal. And so, she became a cautionary tale. She was beautiful, and beauty is dangerous. Greek mythology is filled with stories of women whose fates serve as warnings. Pandora, who opens the jar. Helen, who causes a war. Clytemnestra, who kills her husband. She was desired, then desire must be punished. She was harmed, then blame must be placed. She was transformed, then power must be contained. This was not unique to Medusa. Each is remembered not for who she was, but for what her story taught others. In this way, Medusa's myth served the social order. It reinforced the boundaries. The same figure who represented chaos and danger could also be a shield. The same monster who symbolized the loss of control could also be a source of protection. But even within this framework, there were contradictions. Because Medusa was not simply feared, she was also revered. Her image was everywhere, carved into the front of shields, painted on armor, perhaps something else entirely, worn as pendants, placed at the entrances of temples and homes. She was a protector, a guardian against evil. The very sight of her face was believed to ward off harm, drive away enemies, keep the household safe. This paradox of fear and reverence gives us insight into the complexity of ancient Greek religion and society. It depended on who was looking. To the soldier, Medusa was a weapon. To the priest, a divine warning. Their society was built on different values, war, and discipline, rather than philosophy and commerce. They could not own property independently. They were expected to remain indoors, raise children, manage the household. To the philosopher, a metaphor, and to the woman. Unfortunately, we do not have Medusa's voice. He receives divine gifts to help him on his quest. A reflective shield from Athena, winged sandals from Hermes, a sword from Hephaestus. Nor do we have the voices of the women, who might have told her story differently. Most of what survives from ancient Greece was written by men for men, preserving their view of the world, their myths, their logic, their gods. Even when women appeared in these texts, their presence was shaped by male imagination, idealized or condemned, never truly their own. And so, Medusa became what society needed her to be, not what she was. This rewriting of identity was not limited to myth. It echoed throughout Greek life. Women in Athens, for example, were legally and socially restricted. They could not vote. But in contrast, in Sparta, women had more freedom. They could own land, they were educated, they trained physically. And yet, even there, the stories told of powerful women still ended in silence or tragedy. Because across the Greek world, the idea of a woman with power, especially power that came from within herself, was deeply unsettling. It challenged the structure. And so, such figures were folded into myth and reworked into something manageable. Medusa, the guardian of Athena's temple, was reimagined as a threat. Her transformation, far from being a tragedy, was told as a necessary act of divine order. And her death, at the hands of Perseus, was celebrated as a heroic victory. Perseus himself is often portrayed as a noble and just man, a demigod son of Zeus, brave and clever. He does not confront Medusa directly, but instead uses the shield to avoid her gaze, striking her from behind. This method of killing without facing her has been read by some as cowardice, by others as cunning. But perhaps it also tells us something else, that even in myth, looking directly at Medusa was too dangerous, too real, too close, too much. She had to be killed in reflection, in avoidance, and even in death, she retained power. And sometimes, beneath centuries of dust and retelling, something of the original still breathes. Her head, severed, still turned men to stone. Her image lingered, sometimes feared, sometimes revered, sometimes misremembered, but always present, always watching. Roman poets like Ovid told Medusa's story in careful, haunting lines. He offered perhaps the most enduring version, that Medusa had once been beautiful, and that Poseidon had violated her in Athena's temple, leading to her transformation. Still guarded Athena's shield, still whispered at the edges of story. This duality, monster and protector, danger and defense, is central to her myth, and it is what made her useful to the elite. Ovid, unlike some of his predecessors, wrote with a tone of melancholy, a sense that this fate, though wrapped in the logic of gods, carried something deeply unfair. To the artists who decorated palaces, her eyes, once feared, became shields. Her snakes, once symbols of horror, became sacred spirals of warning and wisdom. To the generals who carried her image into war, to the philosophers who saw in her face the terror of uncontrolled emotion, even to the poets who saw in her story a metaphor for the fragility of beauty and the swiftness of fate. And in this world, Medusa's story changed again. But for Medusa herself, if she ever was real, none of this mattered. Her transformation became a metaphor for Eve's fall, or for the corruption of the soul. Her face, still recognizable, became an emblem of the fears of a society struggling with its past and future, where women were often accused of witchcraft, where knowledge was kept behind closed doors, where myth lived only as shadow. She did not get to tell her story. They studied old texts, collected ancient statues, filled their studios with gods and heroes. And in this world of rebirth, Medusa was reborn too. She did not get to explain. And so, for centuries, she remained a symbol shaped by others. A mirror, but never a voice. And that silence, the silence at the heart of her myth, is perhaps the most enduring legacy of all. The eyes that returned, Medusa's legacy in culture and memory. It was dramatic, stunning, but not sympathetic. Time does not erase stories. It reshapes them. It weathers them like stone. The sharp edges soften, the colors fade, but the outlines remain. So it is with Medusa. She did not vanish with the fall of Greece, nor with the rise of Rome, even when her voice was silent. As the Roman Empire rose to power, it absorbed much of Greek mythology, retelling it with new accents and new priorities. In this telling, Medusa's punishment was not about justice. It was about shame, about defilement, about divine image. But even as her myth grew more tragic, her image remained powerful. In Roman mosaics, Medusa's face appeared at the center of floors and ceilings, meant to ward off evil, to protect the home, to challenge bad spirits. She was still monstrous, but she was also sacred. In the whispered voices of women long kept outside the halls of power. And though they did not yet change the story, they marked the beginning of something new. And this duality continued to ripple forward. As centuries passed, the Roman Empire crumbled. The world shifted into New Age's medieval kingdoms, Christian theology, feudal lords, and monastic scribes. No longer part of living religion, she became a relic of the pagan past, a symbol, a curiosity. They saw in her not a monster, but a metaphor. Percy Bysshe Shelley called her a nameless thing of evil, that loves to sit and smile and sway the hair, and shake the horror from its snaky locks. Her tale, stripped of its spiritual potency, was retold in manuscripts, painted on illuminated margins, carved into cathedral stones, not as worship, but as allegory. She became a lesson again, but how she felt. But now, framed in Christian thought, her gaze was interpreted as the danger of pride, of sin, of feminine temptation. Still, she remained, because even when reduced to symbol, her image had power. And when the world began to turn once more toward the Renaissance, toward rediscovery, toward light, Medusa returned. The artists of the Renaissance looked back to Greece and Rome as to a lost paradise, but not as herself. She urged women to write themselves into history, to reclaim their voices. Medusa, she argued, was only monstrous because she had been made so by male fears. In truth, she might have been laughing all along. As a canvas, a spectacle, a subject of beauty and terror, Caravaggio painted her in oil on a ceremonial shield, her eyes wide in death, her mouth open in a frozen scream, her hair alive and writhing. She was still the monster, still the head held up by Perseus, still the moment of triumph, not tragedy. Even in the hands of genius, she could not escape the frame. But then, something subtle began to shift. Not in the art, not yet, but in the questions. Why had she been punished? Why had Athena not protected her? Why had her beauty become her doom? Why did no version of the story allow her to live? And then, listening again, these questions echoed quietly in scholarly circles, in hidden corners of literature, the slow, patient unspooling of the myth, a return not to the temple, or the snakes, or the stone, but to the woman, the real Medusa, whoever she might have been. The Enlightenment came and went. Science blossomed. Empires expanded. The world changed its shape again, but Medusa stayed. In the 19th century, romantic poets revisited her tale, but others saw more. They began to ask not how she looked, what it meant to be transformed, to be silenced, to be remembered as a warning when you had once been a servant of the gods. And this current deepened in the 20th century. As women's voices rose, Medusa's story found new resonance. Feminist thinkers saw in her tale the shape of every woman blamed for her beauty, every victim silenced by shame, every story told without its subject's voice. She became a symbol not of fear, but of defiance, not of evil, but of endurance. In Helene Cixous's famous essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, that laugh is powerful. It breaks the stone, and it awakens the forgotten. In modern art, Medusa appears not as the slain, but as the standing, not as the victim, but as the figure of rage and memory. In sculpture, she holds not her own head, but Perseus's. In novels, she speaks. In film, she reclaims her gaze. No longer weapon or warning, but a witness, a survivor, a name. This reimagining does not erase the old stories. It holds them alongside the new, because history is not about choosing one version. It is about listening. What do we hear now when we speak Medusa's name? A monster? A priestess? A victim? A mirror? All of these, and more, because Medusa has become something larger than herself. She is a story about stories, a reminder that myths do not stay still, that they shift, change, respond, that every time we look at her face, whether in stone or paint or thought, we see something of ourselves, our fears, our power, our silence, and our voice. Even now she appears, in popular culture, in fashion, in movements and manifestos. She speaks from t-shirts and street art. She watches from gallery walls and ancient coins. She walks the streets in metaphor, in memory, in movement. She cannot be buried, because she was never truly gone, just waiting for us to see her, not as others told us to, but as she is, wounded, powerful, watching, enduring. A myth, yes, but also a mirror, and perhaps that is her final legacy. Not the fear, not the curse, not even the snakes, but the gaze, the deep, steady, unflinching gaze that asks, what will you remember? What will you repeat? And what will you change? The silence beneath the stones, myth, memory, and the gaze that endures. There is a kind of silence that lives beyond words. It is not the hush of a room left empty, or the breath held between sentences. It is deeper, slower, more enduring. Each version carrying new meaning, new fear, new metaphor. Myths were tools, constructed carefully to teach, to warn, to explain. And Medusa's myth, like so many, was not a biography. It was an answer. The powerful become metaphors. The vulnerable become warnings. The victims are turned into villains. And it often sees what it wants to see, not what is truly there. Far from the cities, far from the temple where she once served. She was not destroyed by Poseidon, not undone by Athena. She remained. That alone is a kind of defiance. She appeared on homes, on jewelry, on shields, not as fear, but as protection. Her face was not hidden. It was placed where all could see, where harm might come and turn away. She became a guardian, her silence, and the silence of those like her, the ones whose stories were never written, whose pain was not recorded, whose truths were inconvenient. Their silence made space for the storytellers, for the poets and priests and painters, for the heroes who needed monsters to slay, for the gods who needed their temples kept sacred, for the society that needed order and a reason to fear women who stepped outside their roles. Each time we retell a myth, we make choices about what to keep, what to question, what to release. And those choices shape not just how we remember the past, but how we live in the present. A symbol of power, a shield, even though no one remembered what she had been shielded from. Each one bears the face of Medusa, but each is different. It reminds us that what we call legend might once have been someone's life. Another looks straight ahead, not afraid, but defiant. That behind every tale of monsters and heroes, there might be a voice we have yet to hear. And over time, it gathers weight. It becomes a pressure, a need, a question unasked. And eventually, someone does ask. They do not rewrite the past, but they mark the beginning of remembering differently. A woman, one who is seen and then punished for it. Her serpents represented sign. Her gaze was a metaphor for temptation. The woman vanished beneath the weight of doctrine. It was art, yes, but also an image of control. Beauty arrested, chaos mastered. Her face adorned floor mosaics and the armor of emperors. Even when used as a warning, she became unforgettable. Even when silenced, her face continued to stare back. Never fully claimed by any one culture. Never finally explained. And in that space and that openness, new voices began to find her. She remained. Even as her story carried pain, her image was used as a defense facing outward, daring harm to approach. One who was changed and then blamed for it. That the image of her once fixed in stone has moved, evolved, and deepened with time. One who was turned into a story and then forgotten in it. A gallery of all the ways Medusa has been seen, recreated, claimed, rejected, loved, feared, changed as drama, as a canvas for power and violence. Of listening not to the loudest stories, but to the quietest echoes. Of transformation. Of unacknowledged trauma made visible. Of honoring not the victor's tale, but the story that almost slipped away. To laugh with her, to reclaim her, to break the spell of fear. Every victim blamed for their pain. Every survivor recast as threat. Who was Medusa, really? What happened to her? Why did her story end where it did? A quiet one, but powerful. Because it is difficult to remain, to exist when the world has rewritten you. The duality of Medusa's image reveals more about the world that made her myth than about the woman herself. It shows a culture wrestling with its fears, with beauty, with violence, with the idea of the gaze of being looked at and of looking back. And through it all, Medusa's silence remains, a constant hum beneath the noise of her legend. To wake each day inside a form not your own, inside a name that has come to mean monster, to mean danger, to mean anything but who you are. Medusa did not scream, did not rage. She stayed in her cave, in her skin, in her silence, but also of memory. The walls damp, the ground cold, the air thick with silence. Not the silence of peace, but of exile, of abandonment, of knowing that no one would ever come to ask why, that no one would believe her if she answered. Her only company, her reflection, perhaps, if she dared to look, or the steady hiss of the serpents that had become part of her. Some see strength, some see sorrow, some see the long shadow of injustice. Others, the glimmer of transformation, not chosen, not born, but given, like a curse whispered too softly for the gods to hear. Her gaze, once feared, is now met with understanding, with reflection. Medusa's gaze, in contrast, was not shaped by choice. It was given to her, forced upon her, and it was the very thing that turned others to stone. The irony is thick. She, who was silenced, gained a stare that silenced others. She, who had been objectified, became an object of terror, and even that terror was taken from her, used. Her head placed on shields, held high in stories not to remember her pain, but to honor her killer. Their lives, so full of texture and contradiction, are flattened into single sentences. Helen of Troy caused a war. Eve took the fruit. Clytemnestra seduced Caesar. These are not facts. They are summaries, shaped by those who recorded them. To a question about power, about fear, about what happens when beauty crosses boundaries, when women step too near the divine. Her transformation into a monster was not a story told to understand her, but to contain her, to explain her fate, without ever asking her what happened. Yet never do we hear her voice. Never do we pause to wonder what it felt like to be her, not just the shape of her face, or the terror in her stare, or the snakes that replaced her hair, but her, the woman, the soul, the silence beneath it all. It is the silence that comes when a person becomes a symbol, when a name no longer belongs to a voice, but to a myth. The most powerful voices are the ones that waited the longest to speak. When meaning is shaped by everyone except the one who lived it, Medusa lives in this kind of silence. You can feel it in the way her story has been told, not even 100 times, but over and over across the centuries. In the ancient world, stories were shaped not only by truth, but by need. To be turned into a story is a strange kind of immortality. It preserves something, but not necessarily the truth. It keeps a name, but changes its meaning. Medusa was once flesh in voice and presence, whether in fact or imagination. And then she became narrative. A tale passed from one mouth to another. She was painted onto pottery, carved into marble, retold in poems, used to teach children about the dangers of pride or beauty or desire. And with every telling, something was lost. Her hands, her voice, her quiet moments alone in the temple, sweeping, lighting candles, whispering to statues. All of that vanished. All that remained were the parts that served the story, the parts that made her useful to the ones telling it. This kind of transformation is not limited to myths. It happens again and again in history, especially to women. The gaze of history is not neutral. It looks with intention. It frames. It excludes. It selects. Imagine her, if you can, alone, in a cave. And yet, she endured. She lived. And over time, that silence began to speak. Not in words, not in new stories, but in the way her image was used. This contradiction is telling. Feared and worshipped, monster and protector, punished and powerful. In many ways, silence is what shaped her myth. But silence is not the same as absence. It is a presence that waits, that lingers in corners, that whispers in dreams. These questions are not answers. And when we listen like this, gently, slowly, patiently, we begin to see Medusa not as a cautionary tale, but as a person. This way of seeing matters, because the past is not static. It breathes, it shifts, and we are part of that shifting. Medusa's silence teaches us to listen more carefully, to stories, to symbols, to the people behind them. And that voice, though it may come quietly, deserves to be heard. The woman beneath the myth, reclaiming Medusa through time. Close your eyes and imagine a long hallway. Its walls are lined with portraits, carved reliefs, and scattered scraps of parchment. One has the wide eyes of terror. Another, a calm expression with serpents braided like hair. One is frozen in death, mouth agape. This hallway is not real, of course. It is the hallway of history. As you walk slowly down this corridor in your imagination, you begin to understand something, that Medusa never stood still. She was not allowed to speak her own story. And yet, her story has spoken across centuries. In ancient Rome, she was a protective figure. In the Middle Ages, she was reframed again. Her myth became allegory, interpreted through the lens of Christian theology. During the Renaissance, artists rediscovered her, but they did not see her pain. They saw her as spectacle. Caravaggio painted her at the moment of death, her eyes wide, her mouth screaming, her blood still fresh. And yet, through each retelling, each repainting, she refused to disappear. What is it about her that held such power? Perhaps it is because her story was never fully settled. In the modern age, something began to shift. Not in the myth, but in the eyes of those hearing it. Writers, artists, and thinkers, especially women, began to ask different questions. They didn't ask what Medusa did. They asked what was done to her. They didn't ask how she was slain. They asked why she was punished. They began to see her not as a monster, but as a figure of survival. And in this way, Medusa's silence began to break. In the 20th century, feminist thinkers saw in her the shape of every woman turned into a symbol. Helene Sixus wrote of her, urging women to write through her silence. Others followed. In poetry, in essays, in art. The Medusa who once turned others to stone became a mirror, not for punishment, but for recognition. A mirror held up to systems that silence. A mirror reflecting strength beneath trauma. A mirror asking, what happens when the one who is feared is finally understood? And slowly, the image changed again. She appeared in sculpture, no longer slain, but standing. She appeared in paintings, no longer alone, but surrounded by voices. She appeared on protest signs, in novels, in classrooms. She became a symbol, yes, but this time, a symbol chosen with care, a symbol of rage, but also of healing, of boundaries, but also of reclaiming, of myth. And in this form, she began to offer something new, not fear, not warning, but comfort. Comfort to those who had been reshaped by the stories of others. Comfort to those whose truths had been doubted. Comfort to those who had been silenced and who now wished to speak. This modern Medusa is not a fixed image. She is not held in stone. She shifts with each person who sees her. And perhaps that is the gift of myth, not that it gives answers, but that it gives space. Space to feel, to question, to remember differently. Even now, she stares from ancient coins, from museum walls, from tattoos and murals, and her silence, long misunderstood, speaks more loudly than ever. It speaks of the power of being seen, of the right to name one's own pain, of the dignity of endurance. Medusa was made into a monster, but she has become something else, a companion in the shadows, a symbol of the stories still untold, a reminder that what is forgotten is not always lost, and that what is silent is not always gone. Tonight, as you drift gently towards sleep, know that her story, long tangled in myth and misremembering, has found a new rhythm, and no longer needs to be shouted. It does not need to be rewritten in fire. It only needs to be remembered softly, with care, with slowness, with the quiet gaze of one who understands that sometimes the mask of power, Medusa, femininity, and the fear beneath the gaze. Let us now begin, slowly, calmly, and gently, to walk through another corridor of thought. You may imagine yourself once more in a quiet space, perhaps a stone hall lit only by soft torches. The walls are covered with ancient tapestries, faded frescoes, and whispering shadows. She is a symbol that spans ages and empires, cultures and beliefs. But symbols are not born. They are built, slowly, layer by layer, shaped by the needs, fears, and beliefs of the people who tell the stories. These images do not speak loudly. They wait for you. They wait to be understood. This is the final segment of our journey, one that looks not only at Medusa herself, but at what her story reveals about the societies that created, shaped, and preserved it, about how myth reflects fear, about how punishment can wear the mask of justice, and about the long tradition of equating feminine power with danger. And Medusa, whether consciously or not, embodies that suppressed anger, the rage of transformation, the fury of being punished for suffering, the quiet terror of a woman who, in being denied agency, gained the power that could not be controlled. Medusa, as you've followed along, is more than a figure in a single myth. So now we must ask, what was it truly that made Medusa terrifying? It is Medusa, transformed, disfigured, banished. Was it the serpents that coiled and hissed in place of her hair? Her suffering made visible what society preferred to hide, that power, even divine power, could harm without consequence. She shields her in the only way a goddess in a patriarchal pantheon can, by giving her a form so terrible that none would approach her again. Was it the power to turn others to stone with a single glance? Or was it the idea of a woman once beautiful, once devoted, once sacred, who was changed, cursed, and made dangerous by forces beyond her control, and yet still endured? In patriarchal societies, female rage is often seen not as a symptom, but as a threat. It is something to be suppressed, explained away, or punished. From the beginning, her story is marked by imbalance. A silence is deliberate, and in that silence, cultures have poured their own meanings. Poseidon, a god of oceans and earthquakes, violates her in a temple sacred ground, yet it is not he who is punished. Women were expected to remain indoors, to bear children, to manage households quietly and without attention. Female power was acceptable only in the abstract, in goddesses, in symbols, in stories. But in life, it was feared, distrusted, controlled. Why? Not because she sinned, but because she was a disruption. She broke the illusion of purity, of untouchable sanctity. Athena, goddess of wisdom, does not protect her. Instead, she punishes her. Or perhaps, was it a curse or a defense? The myth does not say. In classical Athens, where the myth gained traction, society was tightly ordered. Medusa, even as myth, broke that mold. She had power. It was not soft, nor nurturing, nor decorative. It was defensive, automatic, unforgiving. It made others afraid. And so, in stories, she had to be isolated, othered, made monstrous. This dynamic is not unique to Medusa. We see it echoed across myths. Lilith, the first woman in some Judaic traditions, was cast out of Eden for refusing to be submissive. Pandora, the first woman in Greek mythology, was blamed for releasing all evils into the world. Eve, in Christian tradition, was the one who reached for knowledge and brought about the fall of man. Always it is the woman who is punished for seeking power, for resisting order, for desiring autonomy. Medusa is part of this lineage, not aggression, not vengeance, but protection, a way to stop the cycle. Her cave is on the edge of the world. She harms no one who does not approach her. She does not hunt. She does not rage. She waits to create distance, to say without speaking, No closer. Not again. But unlike the others, she did not weep. She did not repent. She became something else entirely terrible. Yes, but also untouchable. And that, too, frightened society. Because power without permission is always unsettling to the powerful. And feminine power, when not given, but taken, must be framed as evil, as dangerous, as unnatural. So Medusa becomes a monster. Her beauty forgotten, her past erased. Only the curse remains, only the stare. But beneath that, if we listen carefully, we hear a deeper theme. A theme of transformation, of survival through adaptation, of autonomy found in exile. Even her gaze, so often feared, can be seen as an act of control. In many versions of the myth, Medusa lives alone after her transformation. She becomes the guardian of boundaries, the keeper of thresholds, a warning to those who would cross lines without thought. And yet, in stories, she must be slain. Not because she is attacking, but because she exists. Not because she did wrong, but because she was wronged. Because she holds a power that cannot be explained within the rules of the world that made her. Perseus, the hero, is sent to kill her. He does not face her. He uses a mirrored shield. He beheads her while she sleeps. And this is considered noble, triumphant. But what if it isn't? What if it is cowardice? What if it is the final silencing? Even in death, her head is powerful. Athena places it on her shield. It protects, it defends. But it also reminds that once there was a woman who was transformed, and that transformation was feared more than the crime itself. In the centuries that followed, Medusa's image would be repurposed again and again. She became decoration, a talisman, a motif. But rarely was she remembered as a person, as a life, her emotions, her loneliness, her endurance. These things were not recorded, only her image, only the power that others projected onto her. And so she became a mirror, not just in her myth, but in her meaning. A mirror of fear, a mirror of repression. The shadows of temples and myths still linger, but now they are joined by flickers of modern light, by the warm, gentle glow of rediscovery. Her image was a warning, her myth a message. She was used as a tool to teach fear, to reinforce power, to preserve a social order that demanded silence. The Enlightenment, the age of science, the Romantic period of art and revolution. All of these contributed to a shifting view of myth and history. Not for her monstrosity, but for her mystery. Painters and sculptors began to depict her not in the moment of death, but in the stillness before it. Not as the creature with wild eyes and flaring nostril, but as a woman calm, distant, watchful. Her gaze, once interpreted only as destructive, was recast as knowing, introspective, aware of the world's cruelty, but no longer needing to respond to it with violence. A retreat, a boundary, a place where the world cannot reach her, where the rules of gods and kings no longer apply. She is invoked not as a curse, but as a comfort. People share her story when they speak of surviving abuse, to show that stories are layered, like sediment beneath ancient seas, but simply as presence. A symbol reclaimed not through battle, but through understanding, through slow, careful listening, through the quiet act of telling her story in a different tone, a tone without judgment, without fear, without the sharp edges of conquest. That behind every symbol is a soul, if only we look slowly enough to see it, that no myth is final, that all curses may, in time, be softened, not undone but transformed, of reclaiming strength, of setting boundaries, of turning pain into art, into voice, into change. She represents not vengeance, but clarity. The clarity that comes from looking back at harm, at history, at memory, and refusing to be turned to stone by it. A stillness not of fear, but of peace. A gaze not of punishment, but of perspective. a silence not of exile, but of rest, where she can be herself, not what others made her into. And when Perseus arrives, it is no longer heroic. It is a violation, a final injury. And yet, even in death, Medusa's power is undeniable. Her head, still dangerous, becomes a source of protection, a reminder that even when cut down, her strength endures. In these depictions, the serpents in her hair curl not in chaos, but in elegance. In literature, she is given interiority, emotion, voice. In film and media, she appears more often as tragic than terrifying. They shift with the needs of those who carry them. And Medusa, ever fluid, continues to change. She is still used by some to represent fear. She still appears in horror, in fantasy, in games and tales meant to frighten. But alongside those, there is another Medusa, a quieter one, a meditative one, a figure who sits, calm and upright, with eyes open and mouth closed, not because she has nothing to say, but because she is waiting. Waiting for the world to be ready to hear her not as legend, but as life. Her origin is questioned, her motives considered. She is given complexity. And while some versions still rely on the old tropes, more and more are turning towards something richer, something that allows Medusa to be not just a symbol, but a subject. A woman with a past, a mind, a soul. They whisper, not hiss. They encircle her like thoughts, like memories, like quiet protectors. But it was not until the 20th century, in the quiet echo of growing movements for justice, equality, slowly at first, through metaphor and illusion, poets began to write her differently, not as a villain, but as a figure surrounded by silence, misunderstood and tragically remade by the forces of power and divine politics. Writers, particularly women, found in Medusa the reflection of a long line of stories untold. She became the mirror of inherited pain, the face of survival in the aftermath of harm. She was no longer a warning about beauty or pride or feminine danger. She became a reminder of what happens when voices are ignored, when suffering is punished, when fear is mistaken for evil. And truth-telling, that Medusa began to be reimagined with purpose and compassion. Scholars and activists began to ask not how Medusa became a monster, but why. In the 1970s and beyond, Medusa appeared in essays, on posters, in the imagery of protest. Her face, once turned away in disgust, was lifted in solidarity. Her gaze, once feared for its power to petrify, was now seen as a symbol of refusal. The refusal to be touched, to be silenced, to be reduced to someone else's version of events. She became, in many ways, a patron figure for those who had been overlooked, gaslit, or dismissed. She was a myth rewritten, not to erase the pain, but to honor it. Not to restore innocence, but to affirm endurance. Why must a woman who was harmed be made into a villain? Why does power, when found in the feminine form, so often become a reason for shame, exile, or transformation? Medusa, they argued, was not a creature to be feared. She was the embodiment of how society distorts trauma. She was what happens when a person's suffering is not believed, but instead weaponized against them. She was no longer seen simply as a monster, or even as a victim, but as a complex symbol, a symbol of rage that is born of pain, of power that rises from silence, of transformation that carries memory, and obedience from those who are not permitted to possess strength of their own. For centuries, her story was told through the voices of others, voices of gods, of poets, of warriors. She was a cautionary tale, an anomaly, a threat to be subdued. But time, as always, wears down even the hardest stone. And in the soft crumbling of myth, new shapes begin to form. And here, in this softened illumination, Medusa's face appears once more, not with the fear and fury it once carried, but with something new, something still and watchful, something changed. A mirror of society's discomfort with women who could not be tamed. And as you sit now, or lie gently resting, you may begin to sense the weight of that. How many Medusas walk quietly through history? How many voices turned to whispers? How many faces turned into symbols? How many stories reshaped by those who feared them? Medusa's story may be old, but it is not ancient. It lives still in the way we speak of anger, in the way we judge power, in the way we remember those who made us uncomfortable. And so, when we remember her now, it is not just a look into the past. It is a reflection, a question, an invitation to see not the monster, but the meaning, and to understand, gently and without haste, that her silence is not empty. It is full of all the things we have not yet heard. From myth to movement, Medusa, in the modern imagination, as the centuries unfold behind us like a long and winding tapestry, we find ourselves entering a quieter, more reflective space. In the ancient world, Medusa was fixed in stone, both literally and metaphorically. The modern era, though still shaped by old beliefs, brought with it new perspectives. Among artists, Medusa became a subject of deep fascination. In literature, too, she returned. It was in feminist thought that Medusa was perhaps most profoundly reclaimed. This reframing became more than academic. It became personal. It became political. In these new interpretations, the cave where she once lived becomes symbolic, not of isolation, but of sacred space. This narrative has taken root in subtle ways. In artwork, her image appears not just as decoration, but as affirmation. Even in quiet corners of the internet, in communities dedicated to healing and storytelling, Medusa's name is whispered with recognition. Of course, myths are not static. They never have been. This modern Medusa is not meant to replace the old. She is meant to coexist. As you settle deeper into this gentle reflection, let her image drift softly before you, not as a threat, not even as a protector. Medusa may still turn you to stone and legend, but here in this moment, she invites something else. Her story, long tangled in myth and noise, has been told once more gently, slowly, and with the care it always deserved. Echoes in the ruins, tracing Medusa's presence in archaeology and ancient sites imagine, if you will, the early light of dawn spilling gently over the broken columns of an ancient temple. The stone is warm from centuries of sunlight, and the air carries a hush that feels older than speech. In this quiet landscape, where marble has crumbled into dust and statues lie buried beneath olive groves, something still lingers. It is not loud, it is not alive in the usual sense, but it remains, like a breath caught in time. And if you know where to look, you may just find her Medusa etched into stone, hidden in mosaics, watching from the eaves of forgotten temples. Sometimes she is alone. Sometimes she is paired with her sisters, the other Gorgons. Sometimes she is depicted posthumously, her head held aloft by Perseus. And yet, even then, even in that moment of symbolic death, her face retains power. It is never passive. It is never erased. The Gorgon on the head of Medusa becomes a motif unto itself. It appears in coinage, on amulets, on the breasts of statues, on the facades of homes. Unlike many mythical figures, Medusa's legacy was not limited to scrolls and oral tradition, but as a figure of elegance encircled by geometric designs and natural motifs. Always somewhere near the threshold between life and death, safety and danger, home and wilderness. Medusa, it seems, was not banished by society. She was woven into it, like a thread of shadow that strengthened the light around it. Her face is serene, her eyes calm. There is power, yes, but it is quiet. Self-contained, she watches, but she does not attack. Why did Medusa appear in so many places, in so many forms? What did her image truly mean to the people who lived with it? The answers, as always, are layered. Medusa was not a single idea. She was a living symbol, a mirror of fear, yes, but also of safety. A monster, perhaps, but also a mother, a woman, a face etched into memory. In these later depictions, her story seems to hover just beneath the surface, never fully shown, never fully forgotten, a whisper beneath the tiles. Archaeologists have uncovered small terracotta plaques bearing Medusa's face affixed above doorways. The intention was apotropaic, that is, to turn away evil. Her gaze, once feared as destructive, became useful. In the classical period, her face becomes more human. The serpents remain, but her expression softens. In Didyma, near the great temple of Apollo, two colossal stone faces were found lying flat, partially buried, weathered by centuries of rain and silence. Their features are majestic. The serpents still coil across their brows. Their eyes stare upward, not menacing, but open. The lines are faint, the details worn, but the face is still there, watching, not to punish, but to witness. We have seen Medusa in ruins in stone, in fragile mosaics worn by centuries of footfall and wind. The texts of Homer, Ovid, and Hesiod were rediscovered, copied, translated. With them came a resurgence of interest in ancient symbols. Caravaggio's famous painting of her severed head, for example, captures not rage, but sorrow. She became a symbol of contemplation, of mortality, of the fleeting beauty of life twisted by fate. In literature, she became a cipher for fear and allure, destruction and desire. Poets wrote of her eyes. Philosophers wrote of her meaning. Her myth was recast again and again, shaped by each age to reflect its own anxieties. She became a mirror, not of stone, but of thought. In sculpture, her head was cast in bronze and placed on mantles, on armor, on the hilts of ceremonial swords, not to scare, but to inspire reverence. No longer was she a monster to be feared, but a woman to be understood. Her face emerged on posters at protests. Her name was invoked in essays and manifestos. She appeared on tattoos, murals, signs, and magazine covers. And in each case, she was not passive. She was not punished. She was powerful. Writers and scholars revisited her myth with fresh questions. Why did Athena curse her? Why was she punished for being wronged? What did it mean that her power lay in her gaze, and that this power was so feared it had to be destroyed? Medusa became a figure through which cultural attitudes toward female autonomy, rage, and silence could be examined. Thinkers like Freud saw in her image the terrifying confrontation with suppressed fears, the paralysis of the mind when it faces the forbiddens, the unknown, the overwhelming. Her petrifying power, they suggested, was not only magical but symbolic. It spoke to the human reaction to trauma, to the mind's defense mechanisms, to the instinct to freeze when confronted by something too intense to process. Survivors of trauma, especially those navigating the aftershocks of violence or coercion, found in Medusa a figure of quiet solidarity. She became a symbol not of brokenness, but of transformation. The serpents in her hair, once feared, were seen now as signs of adaptation, living things that could not be removed, only lived with. The gaze that once froze men to stone was no longer seen as destructive, but as a boundary, a form of self-defense, a way of saying, I have been harmed, but I am not helpless. Artists and patrons alike were drawn to the image of the Gorgon Medusa, now was no longer just a figure from ancient stories. She lives now in sculpture gardens and digital art exhibits, in fashion runways and philosophical dialogues, in school classrooms and online conversations. Her name is invoked in both critique and admiration. Her image, once frozen in marble, moves freely, now through our collective imagination, sometimes clear, sometimes clouded, but always present. She became an emblem of inner struggle, of emotional boundaries, of the fine line between strength and vulnerability, because she represented the paradox of art itself, the power to freeze, to stop time, to hold a gaze forever in place. She has walked beside us through myth, through ruin, through history and interpretation. She has waited patiently through centuries of misreading. And now, in this quiet moment, she offers nothing more than her story told gently, at last, in a voice that sees her not as villain, nor even as victim, but as something rarer, a mystery worth honoring. Her eyes are wide, not menacing, but astonished. Her mouth is still open, frozen not in a scream, but in something that might be called realization. Artists like Salvador Dali hinted at her in their twisted, dream-like compositions. Writers like Sylvia Plath invoked her in verse, not to describe a mythic monster, but to explore identity, control, and the sensation of being watched, judged, reduced, to close your eyes, to let the weight of old myths soften. Medusa came to symbolize not only fear, but objectification, the experience of being turned into something else by the gaze of others, of being transformed into a symbol against one's will. The serpents in her hair still writhe, yet her face is fragile, youthful, vulnerable. In this version, the horror does not come from her monstrosity, but from the moment itself, the sudden violence, the still fresh ending of something ancient and misunderstood. In gods and monsters, in myths, and Medusa, whose image had once adorned temple roofs and household vessels, was reborn on the canvas, the page, and the sculptor's chisel. But stories, like rivers, do not stop at one shore. They flow onward. They carry fragments of the past into new waters, into minds and worlds that the ancients never imagined. And Medusa, bound neither to temple nor tablet, followed that current into the world beyond antiquity. A myth whose body may have crumbled, but whose gaze never truly closed. The sheer size of these carvings suggests not horror, but awe. They were meant to be seen, to be remembered. The grotesque tongue-out visage gives way to something more melancholic. The terror is lessened. The features become beautiful, almost mournful. Sculptors such as Phidias and Scopas created versions of the Gorgoneon that were not intended to repel, but to provoke reflection. It is as though the myth began to fold in on itself. Medusa was no longer only danger. She was sorrow. She was complexity. A warning to spirits, to bad luck, to harm. She was, in this way, welcomed into the private life of ancient people. Not as a curse, but as a shield. Not as a villain, but as a silent protector. She left her mark, not just in story, but in matter. Carved into pediments, painted on ceramic, cast in bronze. At the Acropolis in Athens, fragments of architectural sculpture reveal that her image once adorned sacred structures. It is a strange thing to think about, perhaps that Medusa, punished by Athena, was also honored in Athena city. But this contradiction reflects how myths evolve, how symbols outgrow their stories. Her image served multiple purposes, and in stone, it transcended narrative. It became ritual, familiar, embedded in the spiritual life of the polis. Found in the heartlands of archaic Greece, these images are striking. It is part of the Temple of Artemis, dating from around 580 BCE. And at its center, dominating the gable, is a large, imposing image of Medusa. Her arms are bent at the elbows in a running posture. Her feet are poised in motion. Her face is frontal, staring. Around her, she is flanked by panthers, but it is she who commands the space. This is not the tragic Medusa of later stories. This is Medusa, the guardian, Medusa the centerpiece. Her form is stylized, abstracted, and powerful. There is no sign of victimhood, only presence. Not delicate or mournful, but bold, startling even. Medusa's face stares outward, wide-eyed, mouth open, tongue protruding. The expression is exaggerated, meant to ward off evil, to stop harm in its tracks. These are not subtle portraits. They are talismans. They serve a clear ritual function, to protect, to frighten, to hold a boundary. Her presence is recorded not only in poems and mythological accounts, but in the very architecture of ancient life. And in this segment, we gently explore these traces, physical, weathered, and quiet, of a figure who has been both feared and revered for thousands of years. The oldest known depictions of Medusa date back to the 7th century BCE. In the ancient city of Corfu, an island off the northwest coast of Greece, stands one of the earliest and most complete temple pediments known to us. And as we trace her image through time, we see it again and again, on temple doors, on shields, on tombs and household vessels. The gorgonion was especially common in domestic settings. In sanctuaries, too, she had a place. As we move forward through time, the depictions of Medusa begin to shift. This duality is visible in Roman mosaics as well. In the House of the Faun in Pompeii, for example, Medusa appears not as a fearsome monster. Even in the catacombs and buried ruins of the Roman Empire, her presence remains, sometimes carved into sarcophagi, sometimes etched on mirrors or personal items. As archaeology advanced in the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars began to pay closer attention to these recurring patterns. In Anatolia, present-day Turkey, excavations have uncovered massive Medusa heads from Roman structures. And even in decay, they endure. Today, when visitors walk through the ruins of Ephesus or Corinth or Selenunt, they may pass by a carved gorgonion without even realizing what it is. To remind, to remain. And so Medusa continues to exist, not just in story, but in stone. She is not only the myth remembered in books. She is the pattern beneath the dust, the shape beneath the leaves, the guardian in the doorway, the echo in the marble. And as the light fades once more across the ancient hills, her image settles quietly into the earth silent, still and softly enduring. The afterlife of a myth, Medusa in memory, symbolism, and cultural echoes. Let us remain still for a little while longer, drifting gently through the quiet corridors of meaning that stretch beyond time. As Europe passed through the Middle Ages and into the flowering light of the Renaissance, artists, scholars, and theologians began once more to sift through the bones of antiquity. But this Medusa, as she appeared in the Renaissance, was changed again. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Caravaggio did not depict her as archaic or grotesque. Their Medusa was beautiful, tragic, human. The Renaissance Medusa was no longer a ward against evil, as she had been in the archaic period. And so Medusa endured not just in myth, but as metaphor. In the 19th century, with the rise of psychology and the study of the unconscious mind, Medusa's gaze began to be interpreted through new lenses. Though such readings may not align with modern psychological understanding, they contributed to the ongoing evolution of the myth. The 20th century brought yet another wave of transformation. As modernism and postmodernism took hold of literature and art, Medusa appeared in poetry, in sculpture, in surrealist painting. As feminist theory and gender studies emerged and grew in the latter half of the century, Medusa was claimed anew. In this new context, Medusa's image began appearing in places far removed from temples and tombs. Her story, once told by men as a tale of conquest, was being retold by women as a tale of resistance. This cultural shift also extended into therapeutic and artistic practices. And yet, Medusa's story is not only about rage or revenge, it is also about memory, about what happens to a person when their story is told by others, about how myth, when repeated too often without reflection, can become a form of erasure. For Medusa's most haunting feature may not be her gaze, or her curse, or her serpents. It may be the silence, the long, enduring silence around her thoughts, her feelings, her voice. What did she think when Poseidon approached? What did she feel when Athena transformed her? How did she endure alone in the far reaches of the world? The myth does not tell us, but memory tries to. And perhaps that is why her image endures, because it holds the space where those answers might be. In this space of cultural echo, Medusa continues to evolve. She is the guardian of complexity, of contradictions. She is the question we keep returning to, the story that refuses to settle, the face we try to understand. And now, as you drift toward the close of this journey, perhaps you feel her presence not as a threat, but as a guide. And so Medusa remains, not as a curse, but as a question, not to frighten, but to witness, and not to turn you to stone, but to remind you to rest, and to drift gently into the peace of unknowing. Medusa in marble halls. Power, education, and the shaping of myth by the elite. Let your mind wander now from caves and ruins to the hushed corridors of libraries, the gleaming galleries of palaces, and the vast, echoing lecture halls of ancient academies. Step gently into the marble-floored world of the elite, the place where myths are not just remembered, but reshaped, where stories become tools. Over centuries, as empires rose and fell, the stories of ancient Greece were preserved by a particular class of people scholars, monks, rulers, and intellectuals who lived far from the fields where myths were born. These were not farmers whispering tales by the hearth. These were men in robes, surrounded by scrolls, debating meaning and symbolism by lamplight, recording what they believed worthy of remembrance. And where the face of Medusa, so often carved in fear and sorrow, is pressed into service not by poets or victims, but by those who have long held the reins of society. In Rome, boys raised for leadership would study Ovid's Metamorphoses, memorizing the tale of Medusa, not as a psychological study, but as part of a grand catalog of divine transformation. The emotion was abstracted, the moral was simplified. The figure herself was flattened into theme. Her transformation was interpreted not as tragic, but just a punishment for vanity, for seduction, or even for association with pagan gods. In some interpretations, she became a representation of lust, temptation, or demonic femininity. Her snake-covered head mirrored the serpent in Eden. She was linked to ideas of rationality, the Enlightenment, even the sublime. European elites, especially those who saw themselves as inheritors of Greek and Roman tradition, decorated their halls with her image. But it was always a controlled image, curated, contextualized, made safe. The myth was useful, aesthetic, intellectual, but not personal. Her gaze was compared to the power of art to arrest the senses. She became a metaphor for the uncanny, the unknowable, the dangerous beauty that lies at the edge of reason. And while these discussions were rich in philosophical nuance, they rarely paused to consider the woman behind the myth. Her petrifying gaze was likened to the soul's fall into sin. In many ways, myths survive because the powerful choose which ones to keep. In medieval monasteries, Christian monks copied Greek and Roman texts, preserving them not always out of reverence, but often out of curiosity or scholarly duty. These scribes lived in cloisters, far removed from the world of Greek myth. Sometimes it is a carved relief, sometimes a coin delicately labeled, sometimes a sculpture set against velvet drapes and gold plaques, but rarely is she named fully. Rarely is the tragedy noted. Rarely is the context acknowledged. Scholars, particularly those emerging from outside the traditional systems of classical education, began to reread Medusa with a more critical eye. Psychoanalysis, feminism, cultural studies, all these movements chipped away at the old interpretations, revealing the limitations of centuries of elite storytelling. Yet through their labor, stories like Medusa's were kept alive, not just in fading oral traditions, but in ink and parchment. And in these ivory towers, Medusa's image was refined, detached from her emotional roots, and reconfigured into metaphor, morality, and sometimes warning. Wealthy patrons, particularly in Florence, Rome, and Venice, commissioned grand artworks based on ancient myths. The Medici family, so powerful and so intertwined with art and power, helped revive interest in classical figures, including Medusa. But here, too, she was framed through elite eyes. She was reimagined in journals, in independent presses, in underground art movements. And slowly, her myth began to seep out of the elite frameworks that had once controlled it. Her image was rendered in elegant marble busts and painted onto polished panels. And while some artists imbued her with sorrow or pathos, the overall narrative remained one of control. Man conquers monster. Reason defeats chaos. Beauty is reclaimed through art. And thus, she became an instrument of the state, a motif used to underscore the narrative that law, order, and divine sanction could defeat chaos. She was displayed not in caves or homes, but in temples, forums, and triumphal parades. And again, her image moved upward, appearing in cathedrals, in manuscripts, in ecclesiastical ornament. They saw her through the eyes of Perseus. They judged her through the righteousness of Athena. That myth is not fixed. That history is not a fortress. They displayed her image in ways that suited their worldview, powerful men, defeating chaos, rationality overcoming wildness, civilization rising over the imagined savagery of emotion and femininity. Imagine stories drifting through time, not held in silence, but reshaped with every hand that touches them. In the distance, you may hear the echo of sandals on marble, the rustle of robes in Roman forums, the quiet scratch of quills in candlelit monasteries. Writers looked again at the earliest versions of her myth and asked, was she really a monster? Or was she made monstrous by others' fear of her power? Not of horror, but of experience. They became badges of survival. Every serpent coiled in her hair now carried a memory, a wound endured, a voice reclaimed. Where once the elite saw her as a danger to be conquered, modern readers began to see her as a reminder that some stories were never told fully in the first place. What did it mean that she had once been a mortal woman, beautiful and devoted, only to be punished for something beyond her control? Her story offered a soft, symbolic way to process trauma, particularly the kind that was silenced, denied, or rewritten by others. Survivors found comfort in her image, not because she was powerful in the traditional sense, but because she had been denied her own story and still endured. But now, the world has changed. The myths that once belonged only to emperors, philosophers, and cathedral ceilings now reach into new spaces. No longer simply the just and distant goddess, Athena came under scrutiny. Why had she cursed Medusa? It became a way to talk about systems that harm even those within them. A way to reflect on how institutions, even those meant to protect, can sometimes replicate the very power they claim to resist. Some confront the violence hidden in language, in tradition, in ancient stories that were never as simple as they seemed. But even these retellings are part of healing. They take the story out of the marble halls and return it to the hands of the people. But even there, the meanings shift. The fashion house Versace famously uses her image. But what does it mean now to wear the face of Medusa on a garment or a ring? She is, more than anything, a symbol of the stories that resist closure, the myths that open doors instead of closing them, the figures we return to again and again, not because they are simple, but because they contain us. Is it a symbol of beauty, power, elegance, or something deeper, a knowing echo of a figure who has been everything to everyone and yet still resists being fully known? They remind us that myth is not a set of instructions, but a conversation slow, unfolding, and unfinished. In journal entries where someone writes, perhaps for the first time, I am not a monster. I am someone who was made into one. A myth no longer bound to fear. A figure not frozen in stone, but slowly unfurling in memory. What did it mean that a woman in power had sided with the violator, not the violated? Watching the horizon, not turning anyone to stone, simply witnessing. Scholars and storytellers explored the possibility that Athena herself had been shaped by a patriarchal order, that her divine justice was not infallible, but complicated, perhaps even compromised. New voices, new questions, rarely sympathetic, often symbolic, and always curated by the elite Students read Ovid and Hesiod, yes, but also essays by Helen Sixtus, Audre Lorde, and Gloria Anzaldúa thinkers, who write about the power of reclaiming language, reclaiming silence, and telling stories that were never allowed to be fully heard. In this space, Medusa is no longer a flat image on a shield, but a living symbol of all that we must continue to question and reimagine. Her power, once feared, was now borrowed by those in power. During the long stretch of the Roman Empire, when the Greek gods were absorbed and renamed, Medusa became a trophy, literally and symbolically. Her severed head was emblazoned across the armor of emperors, including the mighty Augustus himself. It was printed on coins, cast onto shields, not as a sympathetic figure, but as a mark of imperial terror. Contemporary artists, many of them women, queer, non-binary, or otherwise excluded from traditional canons, began to imagine her not with horror-stricken eyes, but with calm, watchful grace. Her body, once rendered as monstrous or bestial, became fully human, and fully her own. The gaze that once petrified now expressed a boundary. I see you. I know what you did, and I am not afraid. A sign that the emperor, like Perseus, could conquer even the greatest threats. This was not a Medusa mourned. It was a Medusa mastered. In elite circles, this interpretation grew comfortable. Perseus was heroic. Athena was wise. Medusa, tragic or not, had been dealt with. And so the story was taught, generation after generation, through the tools of the elite: sculpture, coinage, classical education. Centuries passed. The empire crumbled. Yet the educational model persisted. But this came with new filters. Christian theology saw Medusa through a moral lens. She was not merely dangerous. She was sinful. In this theological context, Medusa was used to teach restraint, to enforce gender roles, to caution against pride. The Renaissance revived classical learning, but it did not radically change this pattern. In elite academies and salons, Medusa was discussed not as a victim or survivor, but as a symbol in a long line of allegories. As colonial powers expanded into the world, bringing with them books and busts and marble replicas of ancient culture, Medusa went with them. And in this long journey, Medusa's story was again distanced from its emotional core. But even within these marble halls, change was slow to grow. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, new thinkers began to question the narratives passed down through elite channels. They asked, why had we accepted Perseus's version without question? Why was Athena's role so rarely interrogated? Why had Medusa been reduced to a head without body, without voice? And from these questions, new readings emerged. Artists and writers on the margins began to paint her differently, not as a threat to be defeated, but as a figure excluded from her own story. Still, her presence in official spaces remained. To this day, you can walk into the great museums of the world, the Louvre in Paris, the Uffizi in Florence, the British Museum in London, and find her image behind glass. Because myths, when curated by power, are often stripped of their sharp edges. They become tools for education, for display, for performance, but not always for empathy. And yet, in that contrast between the Medusa in stone and the Medusa in story, between the myth told by the elite and the myth felt by the forgotten, there lies the heart of her endurance. Because no matter how often her story was retold to serve the purposes of the powerful, the trace of her truth remained. In the silence between the lines, in the eyes carved into marble, in the stillness of an image that refuses to be fully tamed, Medusa's presence in elite spaces tells us much not only about her, but about us, about how we use stories, about who gets to tell them, and about what happens when a myth is polished for the gallery but left unspoken in the home. Medusa and modern memory, controlling the narrative, reclaiming the myth. Close your eyes again and picture the slow turning of pages in a library that has no walls. And it is here, in this quieter, broader moment of cultural reflection, that we return again to Medusa, not as symbol, not as ornament, but as something far more enduring, a story being reclaimed. For centuries, Medusa's narrative was shaped, edited, and controlled by people who rarely questioned the structure they inherited. But the past few generations have seen something shift, not with loudness, not with violence, but with a soft and persistent insistence that all stories deserve another telling. And so, in quiet essays, in poems shared between friends, in murals painted on forgotten city walls, Medusa re-emerged, not as she was defined, but as she was felt. In feminist literature of the late 20th century, her voice came through with growing clarity. And suddenly, the myth no longer felt distant. It felt familiar. For how many people, especially women, especially the marginalized, had been punished for their pain, silenced for their anger, vilified for surviving? Medusa's story became a mirror. In this reframing, the snakes became something more than symbols of terror. This shift was not only literary. In visual art, too, Medusa took new forms. There was pain in these reinterpretations, but also healing. Medusa became an emblem in therapeutic spaces. In this new mythic landscape, even Athena's role was re-examined. This, too, added depth not only to Medusa's tale, but to the entire mythological framework around her. In modern classrooms, the story of Medusa is now often taught not as a finished tale, but as an evolving one. She appears in art therapy sessions, in activist slogans, in quiet conversations between friends. And her gaze, which once turned men to stone, is now a metaphor for seeing things too clearly, for understanding, for not looking away. Not all reclaimings are comfortable. Some are sharp. And what of the old symbols? The Gorgoneon still exists. Medusa's head still stares out from buildings, logos, and coins. That ambiguity is perhaps her truest power. Medusa is not simply a cautionary tale, nor merely a misunderstood icon. And so we leave her now, not silenced, not conquered, but gently acknowledged. You may picture her once more standing at the edge of a quiet sea, her serpents resting lightly against her shoulders, her eyes not angry, but aware. And in that gaze, there is no threat, only remembrance, only meaning, only peace. Final reflections. Myth as mirror, time as gaze. As we begin our final stretch through the quiet corridors of this ancient story, let the pace slow even further. There is no rush now, only the soft rustle of thoughts settling, memories drifting into gentle place. You've walked through centuries tonight, through ruins and temples, scrolls and poems, art and silence. You've traced the arc of a single myth, but also glimpsed the shape of something larger. A strange and persistent way, human beings use stories to understand themselves. The word myth often suggests fantasy, untruth, fiction. But myths have always held more power than that. Even in her earliest forms, etched onto clay or cast in bronze, she was more than a character. She was an idea, a symbol, a possibility. They are not merely false stories. They are emotional truths wrapped in narrative form. They are dreams shared between generations. They are explanations, yes, but also reflections, expressions, longings. They are the world trying to speak back to itself in metaphor. And now, with all that gathered knowledge tucked gently into your mind, it is time to sit with it. Not to analyze, not to debate, but simply to be present with what has lingered. There are thousands of myths, thousands of names that have been buried by time, and yet Medusa remains. She persists. Why? She is not reducible to a single moral or message. She is layered, paradoxical, incomplete, and in that complexity, she feels familiar. In other hands, she was softened, made beautiful, poetic, tragic. We, too, are shaped by stories, some chosen, some imposed, some still being written. We live in myths of family, of culture, of nation, of memory. This is not simply about justice for a character long misunderstood. It is about reclaiming agency over the stories that shape us all. We absorb stories told about us, even if we never agreed to them. And sometimes, like Medusa, we are forced to carry meanings that were never ours to begin with. And in yet other hands, especially more recent ones, she has been reclaimed, given back her voice, her anger, her silence. It moves in subtle ways, through language, through norms, through the stories that define us. Myths, in that sense, are not neutral. They are tools. They shape how people see themselves and how they see others. And in that shaping, they create the boundaries of what is possible. Let's begin again quietly with the idea of the myth itself. When we speak of myths of Medusa, of gods and monsters, of transformation and curses, we are speaking in many layers at once. And the myth of Medusa has always done that, offered something reflective. A woman transformed into something feared, a face that could not be looked at, a power that both protected and isolated. And across time, this symbol has shifted, as all living myths must. In some hands, Medusa was made monstrous to explain fear, to justify conquest, to simplify blame, to name it, fear it, admire it, and sometimes reject it. And nowhere is that negotiation more visible than in how we treat the feminine in myth. Medusa has served as an unwilling vessel for that negotiation for thousands of years. They've begun to reread not just Medusa, but all of mythology, to ask whose voice was lost, whose pain was ignored, whose power was feared. From her earliest curse to her most modern reclamation, she has carried the weight of how cultures see women, power, beauty, violation, resistance, and justice. They are invitations to reflect, to imagine, to expand. But about us, that we return to Medusa again and again, not to know her, but to know ourselves. This constant evolution reveals something very human. Our deep, ongoing need to make sense of power. It's telling that her story, more than many others in Greek mythology, still holds so much attention. Perhaps because she is not just one thing, because we too are layered. The philosopher Michel Foucault once said that power is not just something wielded from above. Think then of the power in retelling, in questioning, in revisiting old myths with new eyes. When someone asks, why was Medusa cursed? They are not only asking about mythology, they are asking about power, about memory, about blame. And the answer is never simple. It shifts depending on who is telling the story and when. In Homer, she is barely mentioned a footnote. In Hesiod, she is one of 3 sisters slain by Perseus. In Ovid, her backstory emerges a mortal priestess, beautiful and wronged. You've seen how she was once feared, how she was silenced, how she was used, and then how she was remembered. And now, how she has slowly begun to speak again, not in anger, not in thunder, but in stillness, in knowing. There is no more myth to unfold, no more transformation to trace, no more marble halls or winding forest paths. Let's return to the first place we saw her, long ago, before the temples, before the warriors, before the stories turned sharp. Let's go back to the shoreline, where the water is still, and the sky turns from blue to the softest gray. Just the calm, soft light that comes after a long journey. And tonight, you have held one gently, fully, without needing to fix or solve or decide. After all the questions have been asked, after all the silence has been honored. In Renaissance art, she is ahead, severed yet sublime. In feminist critique, she is a symbol of rage and transformation. In therapy, she is a mirror of trauma. In popular culture, she is everything from villain to heroine. And through all these versions, one truth emerges not about her, necessarily. This is what myth does. It speaks not in facts, but in resonances. Not in answers, but in questions. And those questions about voice, violence, justice, survival are as alive today as they were when the first storyteller looked out across the sea and imagined a woman whose gaze could stop the world. The rhythm of your chest rising and falling, the gentle letting go that comes when the mind begins to wander, not in confusion, but in peace. There is no need to remember every detail. No need to hold on to each name or gate or stone. What matters now is the feeling of having listened, of having honored, of having drifted gently through the vast waters of myth and memory. Perhaps it is not the gaze that is dangerous, but the silence that follows it. The way people look, but do not see. The way voices are heard, but not listened to. Medusa's myth reminds us that even in ancient stories, the question of who controls the narrative is not just academic, it is intimate. It is personal. Not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet recognition. A nod to something older than time. A presence that once stood by the sea and became more than a face, more than a curse. And so, in classrooms, in living rooms, in whispered conversations between generations, people have started to ask those questions out loud. These are not accusations. And in doing so, you've touched something deeper than fact. You've touched meaning. Because myth is not fixed. It is not marble. It is clay. And each time we tell a story differently, we reshape it just a little. We soften an edge. We reopen a door. We add a voice. That is not betrayal. It is memory. It is care. It is the slow, loving work of reimagining a past that can hold more truth. In this way, Medusa becomes not only a myth from long ago, but a companion in our present thinking. A reminder that every story has more than one side. A symbol not of finality, but of the ongoing, unfolding journey toward meaning. And as you sit now, with this myth resting gently in your thoughts, you may feel that stillness, the kind that comes not from knowing all the answers, but from understanding the depth of the questions. That is the gift of myth. That is the gift of Medusa. A gentle goodbye from the temple to the present. And now, here we are, at the edge of the story, in the quiet twilight after the telling. You have walked with Medusa. You have followed her story through temples and time, through whispers and wars, through shadow and sculpture. There is something strangely comforting in that, because myths, like memories, never truly end. They rest, they pause, they wait, they change shape depending on who holds them. That, too, is an act of reverence. So let's sit with Medusa once more softly now. There she stands, not monstrous, not divine, just present. Perhaps her hair moves slightly, alive but quiet. Perhaps her eyes are closed, not to hide, not to trap, but to rest. She does not need to watch anymore. She has seen enough, and so have we. In the hush of that image, you may begin to feel your own breath soften. So much of history is told loudly, but not this story. This one is different. This one asked to be told quietly, without spectacle, without triumph, without shame. It asked only to be witnessed, to be felt, and to be allowed the space to breathe again. That is what you've done. You've walked a path not through power, but through perception. You've seen how stories shape the world, not always with swords or thrones, but with whispers and wounds and wonder. And that meaning doesn't need to be solved. It only needs to be carried forward, gently. Perhaps tomorrow, or the next day, you will see something, a sculpture, a symbol, a word, and you will remember this story. She became a reminder that even those turned into monsters have stories worth telling. That silence is not absence. That memory is a form of care. And that, in the soft retelling of forgotten voices, we make space not just for the past, but for ourselves. So rest now. Let the story fade into quiet. Let the shapes dissolve into night. There are no more monsters here. Only the calm breath of history settling. Only the rhythm of waves, like time itself, washing gently along the shore. only the steady, soothing hum of memory returning home. This has been Boring History for Sleep, and tonight it was the story of Medusa. Now sleep, if you haven't already. The past is still, and so are you.